Awesome, thank you. the talks that are presented out by our amazing speakers, Andre, NullVoxPopuli, and Jen Weber tonight. And before we get started, just a few words about our meetup, what we actually do, and then we can already get right to the talks that we have today. Also, just like as a general reminder that you can reach us like at NMLimas and Twitter as well. And if you, for example, want to share anything about the meetup, we always like to see this. But also, if you have questions, suggestions, you can always reach out to us via this path. And also, in the very beginning, a quick shout out and a thank you to our supporters of our meetup, who are Harvest on the one hand, who have been like a very year-long supporter of our meetup for quite a long time, and also to Alex Fra. You can find him at Fra Filmmaker on Instagram, who is in charge of the recording, but also the live streaming and the publishing of the videos in collaboration with Posher today, and also has been for quite a while. So to all of these sponsors and supporters, thank you so much for making this event happen with us. And also, who are we actually? We are Joschka and myself. You can also reach us like on Twitter on our handles jkincher and j2jpack. And with regards to our meetup, we are kind of like every now and then meetup. So currently, I think we have like this 2 or 3 months kind of like schedule where we do like talk nights. So something that we do today, where people from the community, core team members, developers, Ember enthusiasts, come together and actually share what they learned about the framework, what they find like super interesting, what they maybe built with Ember like recently in a more presentation style kind of like format. But we also in the past did like meet and greets. Obviously with the situation right now, it's like a little bit difficult to do this, but we are thinking about like maybe also having like a more online kind of like format for this. And if you have, for example, also ideas on how we could actually do this, we're also like very curious to hear from you if you kind of like can imagine, oh, it would be really cool to have like maybe, I don't know, like discussion sessions or show and tell kind of like sessions. Like if you have like interest in this, we would love to hear from you. Also like important to us is that at our meetup, we want to remind everyone that we value an inclusive and welcoming environment. The backbone for our understanding what this means is, for example, also captured in the community guidelines at Ember.js.com/guidelines. But the too long didn't read is mostly that we would like everyone here at the event to be nice and kind to each other, to expect like communication or like interaction with others with positive intent. And also we would really like to kind of like value that you are also like kind to our speakers who are sharing like a lot of like great knowledge with us. And if you can share any gratitude or kindness to them specifically, then this is also something that we really appreciate. And last but not least, probably like the most important point at this slide, like for us as organizers, is always that we want to encourage everyone to think about like things that they want to talk about at the meetup. If you have something cool that you built with Ember, or you learned something really cool about the framework recently, feel free to reach out to us either with like a talk proposal or just like an idea that you have so far. And we can also help you to kind of like shape this into a proposal if you are still not really sure if this is already what you want to talk about. So yeah, just like a general encouragement. If you want to speak, you're always very welcome to do so here. And next up, where can you actually reach out to us? I already mentioned that you can do so via Twitter, but there's also like the way of, how does this work with the slides? Here we go. To do so via like the message feature at like meetup.com. We also have like an email address where you can reach us, but yeah, we check it like every now and then. So probably like your best bet is to reach out to us via Twitter, just saying. And also, last but not least, we are all like on the Ember Discord. If you haven't joined this one yet, I would highly encourage it not only to reach out like to us, but like in general to the Ember community. Almost like everyone is like on here and also like very helpful to help you with any kind of like things, even like beyond of like organizing this meetup or attending this meetup. And just like also like in general, like a really great resource in the Ember ecosystem to mention here. And with this would already be everything about like the meetup general. Are there like any questions or so? Any things anyone wants to add? I think there's also something in the chat. Okay, a waving hand, waving back. Okay, then if there's nothing, we are already here at our agenda for tonight. We will have like 3 full-length talks and also like 1 5-minute break in between, so everyone can maybe grab a drink or something and have a little bit more of like a breather in between like the talks. And first off, we were going to start with a really cool talk about like behavior-driven development and testing and how you can actually leverage this using Cucumber by Andrei Mikhailov. And with this, I give it over to him. If you want to give a round of applause with clapping emoji hands in the chat, feel free to do so. It's always appreciated. And then there you go.
Hey, everyone. Give me a second to share my screen. Okay. And I'll open the chat back. I am Andrei. I am a front-end developer at Calibre5.de, where I specialize in Ember.js. I work there remotely from the snowy from Moscow, Russia. And I am really happy and proud being part of this amazing team. This talk is not really specific to Ember.js, so code samples and screenshots are in Ember, but the general idea applies to every front-end framework and even beyond that. So there are more than enough talks, articles, and even books written about BDD and Cucumber. So you will hear some of this today, but I would also like to share the nasty bits, how terrible Cucumber can be and how to deal with it. I will start with a brief introduction to BDD. We are all on the same page. By BDD, behavior-driven development, I do not mean the assertion style. I believe that you can do BDD with assert as much as you can do it with expect and should. And I do not mean this famous double loop workflow. You are supposed to write acceptance tests and unit tests prior to writing code. By the way, this does not mean that you have to do it in a waterfall fashion. So creating a full test coverage prior to writing any code is not feasible. And you are supposed to work in tiny iterations. You're about to write a line of code, come up with a small unit test, come up with a small acceptance test, write all 3, then proceed in iterations. But my point is, even if you write tests after writing code, for me, BDD is team members.
Recording in progress.
Not only developers, but also managers, designers, representatives of the client, if you're a consultancy, or product owner, if you're a product company. BDD revolves around user stories, which are short text describing how a certain feature that you're about to develop is, how it works, how the user interacts with it. Let's have an example for a very simple feature. Let's say log in and sign up. From the first glance, you might think that you need a couple of user stories to cover it, one for logging in and one for signing up. But then you remember about incorrect passwords, about malformed email addresses, about password recovery. So out of my head, I came up with this many user stories. These are just the names of the stories. So each item on this list should be backed by the actual story, describing how the user interacts with your app and what is the expected outcome. And it includes a few very rare cases, such as visiting a link from the password recovery email while being logged in, or while the link has expired. But if you don't think about such rare cases upfront, you might forget about them later, and your users will stumble upon it, and they will be unhappy, and your client will be unhappy. And typically, it's the developer to blame for forgetting about these, despite that the developer forgot about them as much as any other team member did. So the idea is that all team members converge and brainstorm those user stories prior to writing any code, prior to doing any actual work. And these user stories thread through the whole feature lifecycle, from the conception of the idea to deployment to production. After the user stories are available, the designer will use them as a reference to draw mockups, and the developer will associate an acceptance test with every user story. Those acceptance tests will be later executed on your CI server to deploy to production. This approach has a number of important benefits. As you have seen, it reveals the true scope of your feature and lets you estimate the time requirements more precisely. Certainly, you will never be accurate, but it prevents you from being overly optimistic, and your estimations will be incorrect with a lesser error margin. User stories serve as a specification for your feature, and as being a single source of truth, they have a power of resolving disagreements. You can create a separate issue in your issue tracker for every story, or you can create an umbrella issue for the whole feature, and user stories may be represented as items on a checklist or as subtasks. For us developers, it is kind of satisfying to check out those items as we make progress implementing the feature. But it's also important as an indicator for the whole team, meaning that when you don't have this explicit checklist and you develop the feature over a few days, your team members on the daily meetings will be like, okay, today I am working on this feature, and the next day I am working on this feature. And your teammates will be like, why is it taking you so long? It's just log in and sign up. And with this explicit set of user stories, it becomes obvious what the real scope is, and it becomes visible how you make the progress. Also, user stories focus over users' needs naturally, as opposed to developers' needs. There is a book called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper. The name of the book is a metaphor for the fact that if you put developers in charge for designing the user interface and user interaction of your app, then app development becomes a crazy hospital. This is because developers are very prone to cutting corners and prioritizing geeky stuff over what is actually important for users. Finally, user stories integrate well into automated testing. And for this, you need a software library. I use Cucumber. The name Cucumber appeared like 15 years ago, or maybe more. It was a working title, a placeholder for the project, but it stuck before the author was able to come up with something meaningful, so they decided to keep it. I have visited the GitHub repo of this project, and the first commit dates over 16 years back, as of September year 21. And Cucumber started as a simple library, syntactic sugar basically over another library, but later evolved into a full-fledged testing framework ported to most popular programming languages, especially the ones that are used for building user interfaces. JavaScript has the official Cucumber.js and Yada.js, which I happen to be using because when I started, there was a decent Ember.js add-on for it. And who knows how many more exist on NPM. In Cucumber, user stories become executable test files. So this file, the extension is .feature, and the syntax is called gherkin. It unambiguously maps to an Ember.js acceptance test. The name of the feature is the name of the test module, and scenario names are test case names. Each scenario contains steps, one per line, which are executed sequentially. There are 3 types of steps. Given steps set initial conditions, initial state of your app. When steps represent user actions, and then steps make assertions. Of course, Cucumber is not an artificial intelligence, so you need to implement each step in your programming language, so JavaScript in our case. This is how it looks like in my code base. The original syntax of Yada.js is less convenient, so I came up with this like high-level abstraction. Basically, each step implementation is a function, and the step names in the feature file are calls to those functions. When a function returns a promise, Cucumber would wait for the promise to resolve. Sorry, and the test will pause until the execution of the app resumes, and then the next step kicks in. If you have similar steps, such as I should see 3 posts, I should see 17 posts, it does not mean that you need to implement 17 similar steps. This is thanks to the fact that step names in implementations are actually regular expressions. And for each capturing group in a regular expression, you receive an argument with a matching value. So in this case, the number of posts. This is a very powerful technique, but it's not very convenient. Firstly, because the regular expression syntax is notoriously difficult to read. And on top of this, you need those double backslashes because this is not a regex literal, it's a string, and the single backslashes are escape characters, so you need to escape the escape character. The second problem is that regular expressions return only strings. So if you need a number, you need to convert it by hand, which is not very convenient. Luckily, Yada.js, and probably Cucumber.js too, has a syntax called, they call it dictionary and converters, but I find this a bit confusing. I call this macros. A macro is a placeholder starting with a $sign. And under the hood, it gets paired with a regular expression to match and an optional converter function. So in this case, it would convert a number to an integer, but you can also do floats. You can look up DOM elements and receive elements as arguments. You can parse JSON, convert ASCII tables into data structures, and so on. Cucumber also supports test matrices. Matrices, like plural for matrix. Dude, perfect. So in Cucumber, test matrices require using placeholders as square brackets. You should use them in the name of the scenario so that you do not receive duplicates. And you use them naturally in both seeding steps and assertions. This scenario will be invoked multiple times, as many as there are data rows in the table of values below. Cucumber has a number of important benefits. First of all, the most important one, personally for me, is the separation of concerns. This means that all the pesky details, petty details, I think I meant, are hidden away from you because like all those imports of libraries, specific helper invocations, seeding patterns, this is all visual noise most of the time. typically, when you read through a test, you want to focus on its business logic and not those implementation details. So they're hidden away. You can work with the test on the high level, and this makes it more efficient, and your, at least my head does not overheat as much. Cucumber tests are readable for all team members, and all team members can participate in validating the tests, ensuring that they make correct assertions. Since step implementations are reusable, you can compose new tests by simply calling those steps in a different order with different arguments. So ensuring decent test coverage is very quick, and the test coverage itself also becomes better. Since those implementations are relatively short, it is easy to maintain them. You do not need to revisit them often. They are battle tested, reused in all sorts of features. So you rely on them without having to maintain them. Being part of the BDD methodology, it integrates well into your team's workflow and kind of enforces the workflow. Also, all the team benefits from the fact that tests are written in the same code style. You know how tests are given the least priority when code style is concerned, and reading someone else's tests can be very difficult. To be honest, when I read my own tests written like months ago, this is basically write-only code. I struggled to comprehend it because I did not put effort into structuring and organizing it. With Cucumber, this is not an issue. But this is too good to be true. Cucumber makes a lot of good promises and has an army of dedicated supporters, but it also has a comparable amount of haters. And many of those haters started as Cucumber enthusiasts after reading articles and listening to talks like this one. They managed to persuade their team to adopt Cucumber, spend weeks rewriting their tests, and then they get bitterly and utterly disappointed. Basically, every other claim is not fulfilled. And there are two possible outcomes from this. Either the team makes a tough decision to abandon Cucumber and rewrite everything back, wasting weeks and months of work, or as a Russian joke says, mice were bleeding and crying, but they kept eating the cactus. So the team may choose to keep using Cucumber, but they will stay unhappy about it, and they will keep frowning upon the developer who came up with the initiative. Guess who has been this developer in my team? But I did not give up. I figured that it is not Cucumber as software to blame for it. It's how we use it. I have an analogy for you. Imagine that I decided to try cooking, and I fail miserably cutting my hands with a knife, and I start preaching that kitchen knives are dangerous and everyone should abandon using kitchen knives when cooking. This would be ridiculous, right? So I identified the problems that Cucumber brings, and I came up with solutions to those problems. So today I will tell you about 5 of the most important ones. These are my know-hows. Some are biggies, and they have been known. Like, I'm not the author of those ideas. I came up with them on my own, but they have been known for quite a while. And not all Cucumber supporters agree with them. Others just are tiny tricks. So let's start with problems. The first one is that the library of step implementations keeps growing and growing. Every feature requires some intricate logic, so you will end up both creating new steps for every feature and building on top of existing ones. When you improve, when your assignment is to improve an existing feature of your app, you will upgrade those steps. And this gets out of control very quickly because step implementations can vary across projects while step names remain essentially the same. It's very difficult to look up step implementations for steps. No IDE offers a way like to quickly look up an implementation. Regular expressions contribute to this problem. Two step implementations can both, or even more than two, can match the same step. So Yada has a solution for this. Yada would always prefer a more specific step implementation over a greedy regular expression. But this heuristics never works the way you expect. Like you look at a step implementation and you expect this step implementation to be used. You don't even know that there is some other implementation that will override. Developers get lazy, and instead of looking for step implementation that will cover their needs, they end up quickly re-implementing a new one, and duplicates appear. They may differ in subtle details and phrasing and become a big problem. The second problem is that the step implementations are a black box. The step name can say something, but the implementation can do something else or nothing. Well, we did not have such extreme cases, but many times we ran into a case like this. Consider this example. It says there are 3 posts in the database. The title of the first post should be Hello World. Why is it Hello World and not, say, Lorem Ipsum? To figure this out, to make sure that this assertion is valid, you need to find and look into the implementation of the seeding step. And who knows what you will find there. The developer who implemented it may have used Faker.js. They may have hard-coded the hello world into every post, or they used fixtures. So you do need to reopen step implementations every time. I used to have, that's in the solution. Okay, so as you can see, another promise of Cucumber is not fulfilled. The third problem is that steps can be tied to each other, so there may be implicit coupling. This example is a bit artificial, but bear with me. It says the previously expanded post should contain a comment section. The problem is in the previously expanded part. This step implementation must know which of the posts on the page has been expanded. And what if like several posts are expanded in an arbitrary order? Yada has a solution for it. All step implementations share the same this context. So the clicking step can memorize the DOM element on this, and the assertion step can read this DOM element and make the assertion. This works, but the problem is that it makes the feature file very tangled, and the implementation is very tangled. When you develop on top of it, you run into problems. In our apps, so we used this context very heavily, and when I first ran into it, I wasted a whole day untangling it and swearing and pulling my hair. So though this is a powerful feature, it leads to problems. The fourth problem is with presentational CSS selectors. They are a mess. A non-developer will look at this and assume this step is written in a foreign language. A developer understands that this is a selector, but they still cannot tell if it's a menu item, a sidebar element, or a post title in a list of posts. So you could say, let's solve it by using semantic selectors only. But if there is a technical possibility to cut corners, corners will be cut, especially when you are hotfixing something on production. So don't expect presentational selectors not to ruin your day. The fifth problem is with debugging. If you integrate Cucumber into your framework in the most simple way, it will offer zero debugging capabilities. When a scenario fails, you will only see the name of the scenario and unhelpful error message and a meaningless stack trace pointing to some async stuff in Cucumber codebase. And again, you need to reopen step implementations, sprinkle them with console logs, debuggers, and so waste time figuring out what has happened. Now, two solutions. Those solutions may seem obvious in hindsight, but it took us a while to come up with them, and they're rather opinionated. So, okay, let's proceed. The first problem was the size of the library. I have realized that the user can do only this many types of actions on the page. They can click something, read from the page, they can fill text into the form field or read the text from a form field. They can select an item from a dropdown and such. You know this list from Ember test selectors. And I said, let's use only these highly reusable steps and never use any steps with logic specific to a certain feature. This reduced our step library from several hundred steps. Luckily, we did not reach the milestone of 1,000 steps. That would be a sad anniversary to celebrate. But anyway, so we are now down to a few dozen steps. 2 dozen are very reusable from Ember test selectors, and a few more are relatively rare, such as picking up an element from a power select using async type ahead search. But still, these steps are not coupled to any specific feature. The result is that it's easy to remember all the phrasings, and the steps are so tiny and atomic that you never have to reopen them. You just compose feature files, and you can copy paste step names because the same step names appear in basically every feature. The second problem was with hidden logic, and the solution is to extract all the truth hidden inside step implementations and expose them in feature files. So in the previous example, we updated by showing which specific seeding pattern we're using. And now it is obvious that the first post has the title Hello World and not something else. Previously, we were using a very elaborate seeding pattern based on Mirage traits, which were invoking Mirage traits. This seeding pattern was extremely complicated and large. It seeded like many hundreds of steps in every of our apps. And all tests were using the same seeding pattern. This meant that when I needed to implement a new feature, say I am adding comments to a post, I would improve this seeding pattern with more data, and this may break existing tests. Like I would create a post without comments, a post with a comment, a post with a comment and replies and such, and other tests fail, I need to fix them. The logic, the seeding logic becomes very complicated with if conditions and loops. By the way, Cucumber syntax does not allow if conditions and loops intentionally to improve the simplicity and readability. Instead, you're supposed to create multiple scenarios. And in our new practice, we use tiny seeding patterns. We do not seed any records which are not related to this particular test case. Here is another example. It says that a product should be selected on the page, but what does it exactly mean to be selected? And with the new approach, it becomes obvious. We're checking for the existence of an HTML class, which is responsible for the selected look. And we're looking for a comment section to appear inside the element. The problem with tangled implementations is solved in a very obvious way. We simply stop using this context and reference steps in the feature file. Though obvious, it took us a while to reach this, and it is unbelievable how much friction this solution resolved. With presentational CSS selectors, we of course rely on the Ember test selectors add-on, which tells you that you should use a data test attribute on every element that you want to interact with in your app. And now the step so it is now clear that we're clicking on a post title and not on a menu item. But this approach still has problems. It is still very hard to understand for non-developers, relatively difficult to read for developers, and presentational selectors can still be used technically. So I came up with a custom DSL I called labels. So I invented the syntax. I drop square brackets from this data attribute. I drop the data test prefix, and I capitalize what remains in order for this label to stand out in the phrasing of a step. I also reverse the order of compound selectors. So instead of saying data test post and child to data test expand button, I say the expand button or the second post. This is very natural, and it unambiguously maps to CSS selector. And I made it impossible to use the presentational selector. So anything but this specific syntax will not be recognized. And this made our test cases easy to read for non-developers and resolved another layer of friction. One problem arose with the nth child pseudo selector. It does not work as you expect it to. So when I say second post, I expect this post to be selected. But the nth child does not work like that. It picks the second post from every immediate parent. So it's a wrong post gets selected, and more than one actually. So to solve this, I borrowed the idea of the EQ selector from jQuery. I had to implement it by hand. So what it does, it simply selects all posts on the page in a flat list, and then picks the second one from this list. I use indexing starting with 1 for readability by developers. And as for debugging, I created a custom wrapper function in between a cucumber test case and a QUnit test case. This wrapper would report all step invocations to QUnit. And when a step crashes with an assertion error or with an application error, this error will be caught, the error message will be enhanced, and the error will be rethrown. This is how the resulting output looks like. So for passing steps, first of all, you do see a list of passing steps, which is very convenient. The sneaker icon represents the step name as it appears in the feature file, and the gear icon represents the step implementation name that was picked for each step, and you can see that whether the pairing is correct. When a step fails, you again see the name of the step, the implementation, the meaningful assertion error, and the list of arguments that this step implementation was invoked with. For DOM elements, you do not see just array something, which is what you would see if you tried to cast an array of DOM elements to a string. Instead, you see that this is a collection. You see the label that was used in the step to make the lookup. You see which selector it corresponds to and how many elements matched. The stack trace is also more meaningful. So most of the time you will end up either inside a step implementation, or if the app crashed in the app code, you will have a reference to the app code. This concludes it. In Calibre 5, we dedicate some of our work time to open source causes. And I've been implementing the add-on I called Ember.BDD. It is still in active development. When it's finished, it will be a drop-in solution for Cucumber. So far, it's not yet usable, but I'm getting there. And I encourage you to visit the repo. I have enabled GitHub discussions, which is a new GitHub feature. There's a more casual way to communicate in a GitHub repo, while issues are being more strict. So please don't hesitate to chime in. As a conclusion, I found this amazing stock photo, which I believe summarizes my talk more than any other slide would. Thank you so much for having me, for listening to my talk, and I'm ready to answer questions.
Oh, this was awesome. Thank you so much for this awesome talk. And yeah, let's open up the room for some questions. Feel free to either post into the chat if this is your favorite mode of asking questions, or just like unmuting yourself. And I maybe had like a first question already, which would be, I found it super interesting that you talked about like this DSL that you developed to kind of like make the descriptions of like steps like more readable to like many different people on the team. And I would be interested, because I've also been thinking about like how can you actually make this more accessible, like in general, to teams, what is kind of currently tested, what your feedback has been so far, and if you already have like plans on what you want to kind of like maybe improve or kind of like further iterate on in the DSL.
Actually, we've been using this DSL for at least 2 years. We're very satisfied with it so far. There are still a few minor things missing. I'm not going to elaborate on this, and implementing them properly would increase the complexity of the implementation a lot. So far, we are happy and have no plans on elaborating on this DSL. Oh, one thing, it's mostly related not to the label syntax, but rather to a set of step implementations, is that there is a proposal on Ember RFC to, instead of using semantic selectors, use accessibility approach to selecting items on the page. So select them by the text that the user actually sees, and not with an attribute that the user does not see and is not aware about. Over.
Yeah, that makes also a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, also see like more questions like in the chat. First of all, like also like a 1,000, 10,000% for this RFC. And also like another question here that says, after where you're explicit in seeding the data, doesn't that make your other tests brittle? You discussed how other tests will break with more data, or did I misunderstand what you said?
Yeah, so Cucumber allows to have shared seeding for every scenario within a feature file, but you can also seed each scenario separately. So you have a tiny seeding table for each individual scenario, and they do not overlap. So each scenario is isolated. So messing with one scenario will never break other scenarios.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you. Does this also answer the question for you, Matthew? And also one more comment here by Gonzalo. I had the same issue on Rails with fixtures moving to factories and letting each test scenario create its own models fixed it. Oh, okay, we also have like a question from the live stream. Have you considered using page objects? One benefit I've found with them is that they can be modular. So the implementation is tied directly to e.g. a single component.
Yes, we started with page objects, but then we realized that when we switch to reusable, highly reusable and minimal atomic step implementations, there is a fair amount of overlap between those atomic step implementations and page objects. Basically, page object became redundant, and step implementations serve as page objects, but they are abstracted away from individual components and are more generic. So page objects complicated things a fair amount, so we decided to get rid of them, and we are not using them with Cucumber.
Yeah, gotcha. Makes also a lot of sense to me. I never really thought about it like this way, that like page object is also fulfilling a lot of like the functions of the step implementation syntax. Yeah, more comments coming in here. First of all, yeah, kind of like confirmation that, yeah, 100% agree that each test module should have its own seeding. Then also one comment by Ilya. If you're waiting for the RC, there's an add-on at TradeGecko Ember Semantic Test Helpers, although last I used it, I think it had a minor issue with newer unit versions. He also has an open issue there. And then also another comment here by Preston. I don't like when page objects are tied to a component because they tend to reflect DOM instead of user API.
Yeah, basically the same idea that we had when abandoning page objects.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, any more questions or any more feedback or so? Feel free to also just like chat into the call if you like.
Thank you, everyone. This was exciting.
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you. This has been an awesome talk. Thank you. Cool. And with this, we can go over to a quick 5-minute break. So right now it's like 51. So let's try to kind of like get back here. So like 55, 56 or something. And then we're gonna get started with our next talk by NullVoxPopuli or NullVoxPopuli with resources. See you in a bit. And then I give it over to you. And also don't forget your applause in the chat.
All right. So yeah, I wanted to do a little tribute to Control because they just had their 2-year anniversary recently. And this little upside down pyramid here is the board. They run the astral plane. You should check out the game if you haven't. It's pretty fun. Yeah, I'm NullVoxPopuli. You can find me at NullVoxPopuli pretty much everywhere. I have the following side projects. Maybe you've seen them around. They're in various states of abandonment, in progressness, and occasional readoption. So like from left to right, you have EmberClear, which is end-to-end encryption. In the middle is a REPL for Markdown and Ember together, demonstrating my preferred way of writing docs. And then on the right is kind of an experiment I was doing with the Web Animation API, which is pretty cool. You should check it out. You kind of don't need an animation library anymore. So, yeah. I also want to say that I work for CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike's always hiring. So if you're looking for a job, message me and I can send you some links, or you can just go to crowdstrike.com/careers and then poke at Workday until it gives you what you want. All right, so what is a resource? First, we got to do a brief overview of auto tracking. And as a disclaimer, I guess a disclaimer to the disclaimer. There's a scheduling issue with some maintenance on the roof. So if you can hear hammering, I'm getting my gutters replaced for some maintenance-free gutters, and I'm pretty excited about that. But anyway, back to the original disclaimer. This is a simplified or brief version of auto tracking and not entirely an accurate representation. So let's say we start with a template. This template has 2 references. And this template has a backing component class. The classic first name, last name, full name example. The first and last name are tracked, and full name is a getter that returns them both as a single string. So following the flow of execution, we see that full name from the template will call the getter on the component instance. And then, as the full name getter is evaluating, we're running to a property on the component instance that we need to go look at. So first name is a tracked property, and tracked properties are also references. But because we encounter this reference while evaluating the value of another reference, we know that full name now has a dependency. So we've encountered one reference, first name, which is known to the original reference, full name. So going back to the flow of execution, we run to another property, last name. We see that last name is also a tracked property, which is also a reference. And now the template renderer is aware that the reference, this.fullname, is dependent on these 2 other references, which, to peek under the hood a little bit for a little more detail, we can kind of think that when evaluating a reference, we create a new tracking frame, which is a weak set, and the tracked decorator expands to add references to that current tracking frame via getters and setters. For a deeper dive into how auto tracking works, it'll give you enough detail to where you can implement this yourself. You can check out Zerac's article on how auto tracking works. URL right there. So, what is a resource? It is a helper that can be used outside of templates, or a getter with persistent state and/or lifecycle. All right, so what does this mean? First, we need to ask, what problem do resources solve? So, they protect against side-affecting getters. They bridge the gap with reactive primitives provided from Ember. And they answer the question, how do I safely deal with async data? Because getters can't be async. Maybe you've tried it before, you return a promise from a getter, you see your template isn't updating as you would expect it to do. So what is a side effect? When behavior unrelated to data derivation is triggered and the result of that behavior is accessed elsewhere. And what I mean by that is this. But this has an immediate problem. Just give this code a read and see if you can find it. Right, so the template accessed this.query. This.query starts an async request, and that request returns an object for the records, which points to an empty array. Records was a tracked object. So the async request in the query resolves and sets this.records to a new value. Since this .records is a tracked object, query depends on the reference records. So you go back to the top, and then that just repeats forever. So maybe you've seen assertion message come from this problem. I think it was added in Ember 3.25, 24, somewhere around there, maybe earlier. I don't remember. But anyway, it's like you access blank on an object that was like accessed previously in the same rendering computation or whatever, and it's like just trying to prevent infinite revalidation bugs. So one way we can solve this is just to not access this .records in the query getter. That will avoid the infinite revalidation error. But then we need to access this query getter in the template, and it kind of just looks weird. Because this .query doesn't provide any value to the display. But maybe you've seen this other pattern. Using did insert and did update to get some records, and then you add arbitrary arguments to know when to refetch those records. So problems both the getter side effect and these did insert and did update modifiers have is that they're hard to make reusable, and these types of side effects are undocumented and therefore spooky. And what I mean by undocumented is that like every occurrence of them might be slightly different, and your developers and coworkers might miss minor differences between each of the different implementations. Also, the template ultimately has no business caring about this sort of data manipulation, as it may have nothing to do with a particular element. And with both approaches, you ultimately leak state and intent everywhere. So that prevents the broad understanding of what the focus of your component or whatever your abstraction is. So I'm saying resources are going to solve that, but how do you make one? So there are 3 ways so far, and each of these has different trade-offs, but that's a discussion for another time. But in this imaginary scenario, and I say imaginary because neither of these libraries provide a query resource. But let's say we're using a resource that abstracts the async behavior and various states you would expect from Ember Data's store.query. So you'd expect it to have results, error handling, loading status, stuff like that. And you may be asking yourself, but if it does that, that seems like it has a lot of overlap with Ember concurrency. Why would I use a resource over Ember concurrency? And that is a great question. The answer is that resources are lazy, and they don't do anything until they are accessed. So to demystify how that works, let's roll our own resource implementation and ignore both of these libraries. So minor details aside, and maybe major details depending on how you look at it, this is the entirety of what an inline resource with no abstraction would look like. So this is the part that is abstracted away by the 2 previously mentioned add-ons, Ember Could Get Used to This and Ember Resources. And this is the userland stuff, closer to what you saw in the examples earlier. And maybe you're thinking, this getter approach looks an awful lot like the getter side effect a few slides back. And you'd be right. You're paying attention. This is a side effecting as well as imperative, just like the other examples. But we can do better. So why use resources at all? A resource will abstract the side effects and imperative nature of async data handling so that an app dev can focus on the declarative side of data derivation. Additionally, resources have all these benefits listed here. And most importantly, all of these things fill the gaps left over from the old paradigm of Ember Classic when we all switched over to Octane. So in most cases, you aren't going to be writing your own resource implementation from scratch. So sticking with our query example, let's look at what creating a resource using one of the two previous libraries looks like. Now, when deciding on implementation, regardless of what it is, I like to start from the outside in. What do I imagine the easiest to use public API for the function, class, or add-on is that I'm about to make? So in the top left, we can go the Ember resources approach and provide a single export to use query. In the bottom right, we could go the Ember could get used to this approach, which requires 2 imports. And personally, I like the look of this better, even though it's the same number of key presses if you exclude the decorator. It's just something about the new keyword, but I don't know. If you have a preference over which you like, let me know. I'm interested in that kind of thing. So I'm going to be showing you how to implement a query resource using Ember resources for a couple reasons. I wrote and maintain Ember resources, so I can provide better support for folks that have questions. And the query resource already exists in the Ember data resources package. So if you're interested, you can reference that for a fuller implementation. So over on the right, we have what might look like a resource implementation. Of note, this is all we get for a lifecycle hook. Oh, but what about handling destruction, you might be thinking? Well, we can use @EmberDestroyable, where we can have setup in the body of the constructor, and any tracked data accessed here will entangle with the caller. We have update here, conditional code in the body of the constructor, so any tracked data in here will also entangle with the caller. And lastly, we have destruction or teardown provided by EmberDestroyable. And what I personally really like about register destructor is that you can co-locate setup and teardown, which means you pretty much never need framework provided teardown hooks ever again, which is very exciting. So where were we? This is where all lifecycle happens in the constructor. And this is the bulk of our resource, the start method. When this method runs, it will set the request lifecycle you would expect from an async abstraction, is loading, error, etc. Of note, this part here exists so we can disconnect from an active tracking frame, which allows us to set tracked data without running into the infinite revalidation assertion. So everything above this await promise resolve is entangled with the call site, and everything below won't affect the rendering or trigger that assertion. So over here, we have a little helper function. This is optional, but it is a nice way to provide only one import to the call site instead of 2. Instead of importing both use resource and the resource itself, folks can import this one query function instead. This also has the added benefit of allowing you to customize how the args are passed to your resource. For example, in this case, model name is passed directly to the query rather than part of the thunk function. This opts the model name out of reactivity because only arguments accessed within the thunk function will reactively entangle with the call site. But let's say you don't want to worry about that. What's the bare minimum you can do while still having one import at the call site? And how will that affect the API at the call site? So you could use this one-liner, but it means you widen the API at the call site, which could potentially confuse users. They might be thinking, what is positional? What is named? Why do I care? And that's why I prefer abstracting them. Right, so if you're curious about what the real thing looks like, feel free to take a look at Ember Data Resources on GitHub. So what else could be done with resources? So Ember Array Map resource is like array.map, but you can reassign array references, which are records in this case, And the transform you apply will only be applied to the added or updated records using object identity to track equality. Most of the utility comes from expensive transforms where you don't want to be rerunning the transform on every array element every time the array changes. So you can just reassign records willy-nilly, and the transform only runs on what's changed. So maybe you want to do a headless UI implementation. So here's an example here of maybe how you would manage a table, and then you can hook up your own DOM to it. Maybe WebSockets. I like this approach because I often feel like using a service for WebSockets isn't sufficient, because sometimes I want multiple connections on the same socket on the page, and since services are singletons, it can get a little tricky to do that. But yeah, ideas welcome. If you have an idea, I'd like to hear it. Resources are new and still ripe for exploration. Thank you. Here are some resources for resources.
Yeah, thank you so much for this awesome talk. This has been super interesting. And also, if like any questions come up here from the audience, feel free to post in the chat or unmute yourself and like ask right away.
Yeah, I've got a question. There is a use case that computed properties and getters are challenging to implement. Say I have a computed property that creates a class instance for every item on the list. So I have an array with Ember data records, and I need to represent each record with a custom class instance. When this computed property recomputes, I do not want to reinstantiate all the classes in order to save performance and in order to persist the state of those instances. Can resources help me with this?
Yeah, that actually sounds like the use case for array map resource, because you get your list of Ember data records, and then you pass them to array map resource, and then it puts them in whatever class you want, and then that class instantiation doesn't happen again unless you add records to that array, or if a record gets swapped out for another one.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? I also see like a couple of comments are also trickling in here. Matthew, for example, is sharing, can't wait to rewatch this and really dive in. Thanks for sharing. Lots of applause as well. Yeah, would also be kind of like curious. You already kind of like compared like different libraries and like the syntax to each other. Like for example, Ember could get used to this with Ember resources, right? And beyond like the kind of like syntax differences, like are there any kind of like other real differences, or is it like more really very overlapping these add-ons?
So behavior-wise, they are about the same. Ember could get used to this. Currently has unreleased code on its default branch, which is like the exact same as the resource provided by Ember resources. But the released version of Ember could get used to this requires that you make a value property or getter, and that's all you can access from it. But they're functionality-wise, they're very similar, and they could cover all the same use cases.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, and also like one more comment here by Matthew as well to shoot over a question maybe on Discord later, which is like also always like great. I think like with most speakers on here, if you have like questions like also afterwards, I think like all of them are also like on Discord. If this is not what you were expecting, then feel free to just like chime in right now. Kind of go like, no, I'm not on Discord, but yeah, I think all of them can also be reached there. Awesome. Yeah, if there are like no more questions on this part, then yeah, thank you again so much for this awesome talk. Okay, here's like another one that actually pops up. Volodymyr is asking, what's the thing about await promise resolve again that you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's kind of a hack to, while evaluating a async function above the await promise resolve, any track data you access will become a dependency of like a getter or whatever that you access that resource from. But after the await promise resolve, any track data you access isn't tied to the call site. I can provide examples in Discord if that's not clear.
Is this only true for resources or for all auto tracking?
All auto tracking. So, okay, so let's say you do access an async function and a getter. Any track data you access in that async function before an await will become entangled with that getter.
Yeah, gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is it. If there's like any more questions, yeah, feel free to reach out. It's later on, like on Discord. And other than that, thank you so much again for the great talk. And with this, we already get to our amazing finale of the meetup and a really, really great talk by Jen Weber, who will be sharing with us how we can actually care for a code garden that is already grown in size. And this she will do in her case study about revitalising an overgrown Ember app. And with this, I would give it over to you, Jen.
All right. Can I get a thumbs up if you have a video on that you can see my slides and hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica, for the awesome introduction, and to everyone who's listening into the meetup tonight, especially those of you in Berlin, and then all of our friends from around the world who've tuned in. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jen Weber. I'm a senior engineer at ActBlue, which is a company that helps process donations to progressive political campaigns and nonprofits. I'm a member of the Ember core team. I work specifically on our documentation and learning resources and the public sites that you see when you visit Ember.js.com. I'm also the author of the Ember Octane cheat sheet, which is a resource that helps you figure out how to change your old Ember code into kind of the new and modern style. I helped write the Octane upgrade guides. And because I've made all of these public resources, I'm going to skip over some of the nitty gritty details of like specific commands and steps and workflows that it would take to upgrade and maintain an app. A lot of the things that I'm presenting today, the details of the exact commands and some of the challenges you might face along the way are available as a series on my blog, as well as in the official Ember upgrade guide. So I'm going to focus my time today on kind of the meta big picture. What is the overall strategy for maintaining a very long-lived or large app? Even if you work on small hobby apps, though, some of these strategies will still help you out. But that's kind of the angle I'm coming from for this talk. All right, so this is a picture of my garden from the start of this past summer. This is kind of like my little green field app. Everything is tidy and fresh and new. I've got some little strawberry plants all neatly growing in a row. I have my anti-bunny fence, and it's good. It's not compromised at all. There's no holes dug underneath the edges. Things are looking great. And here's how it looks later in the season. This was like a few weeks ago. It looks like a wreck. So there's weeds everywhere. And this is kind of like a mature app. So, I've got certain sections of my garden that have really grown in a huge way and other parts that haven't been kept up to date. And there are so many places that bugs can hide. And although it looks messy, my garden is very productive. This is like just one day, about a month ago, the things that I brought in from my garden. This is my first season having a garden in this location. And to keep my garden productive, making these fruits and veggies for me, one of the challenges I have is that my work is never complete. I could spend unlimited numbers of hours trying to get rid of weeds, pick off bugs, treat problems, or even just like try to make it look nicer. But if I wanted to do those things, if I'm dealing with my messy garden, what I don't do is make new garden beds and give up on the ones that I have. I'm going to go fix them up. As a developer, similar to my garden, my work is never complete. And if I was to just start from scratch because I had, an old app that's full of weeds, that's not really necessary. I can instead keep to working to maintain my app as it grows, find ways to deal with the messy sections without starting all the way over. In my day-to-day work, I work on a codebase that's about 15 years old, and it has hundreds of thousands of lines of code. There's some Git commands that you can run that will tell you just how many lines of code are in your code base. And it almost seems impossible that it's that many lines. But if we think about how many engineers are in an organization, multiply that times the lines of new code that they write, subtract the code that they remove, which is probably not that much. You can get to these really huge numbers really quickly, and you have to have a strategy for managing that growth. So what I'd encourage you to do as you're listening to these examples and as you're doing your own work is to think of yourself as a gardener. What does it take to make your code base healthy and productive? So I'm going to walk you through a case study. This is a smaller app, but it's the Ember API docs. And this will probably be a familiar site to a lot of you. This is api.ember.js.com. This is an app that was created in 2015. It's used by Ember developers daily all around the world. And it's one of those apps where it just kind of quietly worked in the background and didn't get a whole lot of attention, except for the times when Ember's documentation structure, the actual data that backs this, changed shape several times. And every time that documentation source, it was like a JSON file, changed shape, documentation gets moved around all the time as files get moved around. Every time it changed shape, there's more and more hacks and conditionals placed into this app. Our requirements change across time. This isn't because there was anything wrong with the original app. We just didn't know the whole story, and none of us know the whole story about the apps we're building. The best we can do is build something that can adapt and grow over time. And if you're using Ember to build one of your apps, you're already off to a good start. So this app, it's not Octane or anything close to Octane, which means that every time we have to tackle big changes or feature requests, the cognitive overhead to get into this app and start making changes is really high. I probably know this app the best, and I don't know it well because I've really only stepped in when there was something that we absolutely had to do. But we know that our needs in Ember community are going to change across time. And so it makes sense to spend some time updating this app, making it more flexible, making it easier to understand. That lets it change from me and a couple other learning team core people changing things to us inviting the community to help out and then finding syntax that is familiar and things that are more readable. So a few months ago, Chris Thoburn, also known as Runspired, and one of the key maintainers of Ember Data, reached out to me and said, hey, I want to help improve this app. I've got some things I'd like it to be able to do to help show off Ember Data better. And Chris said, if you blog about it, I will pair with you to help make this app better. And I said, okay. So we paired like every other week or so for some number of months. And then later on, I also pair regularly with Chris Manson, who's a member of the Learning Core team. He and I paired on this a little bit, and I'm going to share some with you about what we discovered along the way and what the strategies are that helped us to modernize this app. The first thing we did was figure out what our goal was. We wanted to incrementally Octaneify the API docs app and make it a good example of how to use Ember routing and Ember data effectively. So when I say Octaneify, I'm referring to the latest edition of Ember. An edition is a set of syntaxes and patterns that we think represent the best way to build an Ember app. So as we're refactoring, we're not changing what this app does, but we're changing how it is coded under the hood. So the steps that we went through were we needed to write down a plan. We needed to budget some time. We needed to see what tools were available to help us reach our goal. We wanted to work incrementally, meaning that each time we made a step forward in progress, we wanted that to get shipped. We didn't want to have like, a branch that doesn't get merged till next year or something like that. We want the benefits to be available as soon as possible to our users and to other people who want to work on this app. We needed to be careful not to disturb the roots of this app. So if I did a great, big, huge refactor, but I broke things for every Ember developer during their workday, that would be a bad time. We don't want to do that. And then the last thing is we needed to measure our progress. We needed ways to quantify and communicate our success. All right, so this is a screenshot of our plan. The actual items in this list don't really matter. They're very small. You don't need to read them. But the important part of this is that making the plan itself is essential. So what we did was we wrote down everything we thought we could do, all of the options, all of the ways that we could spend our time, all of the different things we could focus on. Then we made our best guess at which tasks blocked other tasks. So for example, we knew that we couldn't rewrite our computeds to use tracked until we were on a late enough version of Ember that we knew it could work with tracked and Glimmer components. That's an example. Then there's other things that were non-blocking. So for example, we could refactor our Ember data models while we are also working on the computeds. We can kind of mix those tasks around. But ultimately, we needed to prioritize them as well. So in terms of priorities, we focused on which things that we were the best suited to set the groundwork of. And then we took the things that anybody could work on and set them aside for later, so that when it's time to invite the community to help us, there's some very well-defined small tasks that they can assist with. So eventually we deleted half the items in the list that we had made because they didn't block anything and they could be done by any contributor. We focused our time on the things that the two of us really, really needed to do to set the groundwork. So the next thing to do was to budget our time. We budgeted about an hour every other week for pairing. Sometimes we paired for longer if we were really on a roll. And budgeting this time, if we hadn't scheduled that time and blocked it out for ourselves, it probably wouldn't have happened. There's so many other things to do. And ultimately, no one was paying us to do this work. This is like a volunteer open source kind of thing. If you're looking at updating or overhauling an app for your work, what this step means is that you should try to estimate your annual maintenance effort. You need to make a case to your manager, to your team, to your company leadership about why you need to spend time on changes that are mostly invisible to your users. If you want to go from like, Ember, let's see, you're on Ember 320 and you want to be ready for Ember 4, that's coming out in next month or so. It's not going to look different to your users, but there's going to be a lot of changes. It takes time to do that upgrade. You can estimate this annual maintenance effort by thinking about how many lines of new code per engineer on your team. Like, how many lines do they write? Think about how much time it takes to maintain the work of just one engineer, and then multiply times the number of engineers. That'll give you some sort of very, very, very rough estimate about the amount of time that you can expect to maintain your code base. That's the absolute minimum, because we're not just trying to maintain new work, we have to maintain all of the work that has been done in the past as well. But sometimes if this isn't already part of your organization's process, you got to start with like what you're doing this year right now, sell that first, and then work towards maintaining, setting aside the time to maintain the older things as well. The other thing you want to do is, as much as possible, describe the benefits to your end users. So what I think about in terms of my garden is like, there's some tasks where if I do the maintenance work, if I remove the weeds that are blocking the sunlight, it's going to result in more vegetables. If you fix some of the pain points in your application, it can unblock new feature development. There's also a lot of maintenance where you can't draw a straight line between the work that you want to do and the benefits to the end users. Maybe those things can wait. You can factor that into your prioritization. And then, of course, there's the risks of not doing the work. So, for example, we might think like, oh, what's the benefit of updating a version of an app? The users are never going to see it. Why don't we just wait until, I don't know, next year or something? That's risky, because if there's a problem with one of your dependencies, like a security vulnerability, and you're so far behind that your version doesn't have security patches for it, you could actually be in a pretty bad spot. And so sometimes when you're doing your maintenance job well, it looks like nothing is happening, but in reality, you've prevented big problems. So try to write down those risks and include them in your arguments about why you should spend some time. Next up is find out what tools are available to you. So when we were doing this upgrade, the two main tools in our toolbox were code mods and linters. A code mod is a program that analyzes your app and makes changes to it when you run a command. A linter is something that looks for problems in your app, things that might be errors or warnings that are about your syntax. So maybe it's incorrect syntax. Maybe it's things that could cause memory leaks. Maybe it's an issue with the way that you've written your HTML that makes your app not accessible. Linters help you catch those things. And if you're wanting to know a little bit about what the specific tools are, what are those code mods and linters that I'm talking about, you can visit guides.emberjs.com/release/upgrading to check those out specifically. But in general, they work something like this. For many of them, you start your local Ember server, and then in another tab, you run the code mod. So here I have npx ember angle brackets code mod, and a flag called telemetry. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the path. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, code mod, my app is running on localhost 4200. That's the default for when you start your Ember app. And I'm saying, I want you to run this code mod on all of my handlebars files. What telemetry does is it looks, this is my understanding of it, I hope it's correct. When you actually run your app, the code mod can look at the built output and use that information to determine the correct change to make. So when I ran this on the Ember API docs app, I can see that it changed 19 files. And what it did was it changed all of the curly brace invocations of my component into angle brackets. If I did this by hand, this would take so long, even on this small app. But when I leverage the code mods, a single developer, can make big improvements in just moments. Another tool in my toolbox is lint fixes. So most Ember apps use ESLint, which can help you find problems in your JavaScript files. There's a flag called fix that will try to make the fixes. So if it's small things like, stuff is using double quotation marks when it should use single, or maybe you're like me and you just forget to put semicolons all the time. It'll do those small changes that are fairly safe for you and automate those. So again, I don't have to make changes by hand in order to get my app looking closer to what I want. This all comes with a caveat that the tools themselves are not flawless. Whenever you run these code mods, whenever you follow these linters, you still have to use your human judgment to look over the diff and say, is this correct? You still have to open up your app and click around or run your tests and see that things are still looking as they should. In my case, I found there was one code mod that Chris Thoburn and I ran that didn't interpret like a link to with positional params correctly or something like that. It was a really strange way of doing it in the app, and the code mod just wasn't, no one understood that would even be a syntax that would come into this code mod. And so we had to go in and kind of fix that one after the fact. And our test suite told us right away that something was wrong. So the next thing was that in this app upgrade, we wanted to work incrementally. And that's because huge overhauls are risky. I alluded to this earlier, but we wanted to make sure we didn't break things for everybody. And so if we had one great big huge merge where all of a sudden one day something that's had like 100 commits get shipped to production, like who knows what could go wrong? And it would be so hard to find out what the cause of a problem was. Instead, we wanted to make smaller PRs at each critical step in our to-do list. This has another benefit that people who are working on the app who have bug fixes or features they get the benefits of our refactor right away. They don't have to wait until like next spring when we finish this. One thing you can do to work incrementally is to refactor your components, your sets of components one at a time. So earlier I showed you a command that ran on all the handlebars files, but you could just pick one product area of your app to run those code mods on, make that be its own PR, ship that, and kind of step towards your goal of refactoring your components. Another aspect of working incrementally is that it means that your idea of done doesn't get in the way of shipping. It doesn't get in the way of your success. If you have this great big branch that you've done all this work on, then you have to get agreement that this is done, that this is enough. Is it done? Are there more things we need to add? And you start having those kinds of conversations. You don't get to avoid those conversations entirely, but you can kind of, those conversations about whether we're done don't block making the improvements on the app itself. And then the last thing is there are tools to help you enforce these new requirements for new work. So let's say, I have my app with 200,000 lines of code. This one's not an Ember app, it's something else. But let's say I have my huge app. It's really not feasible for me to update like hundreds of components at once, but I can install linters and run code mods and just do those styles for new things. So every time someone generates a new component, it needs to pass all of these new linting rules. And that way, we at least don't slide backwards as we're making these improvements. So there's a bunch of tools that can help you with making these incremental updates to improve your app style. One of them is built right into Ember template lint. There's a feature called to do, and you can run a couple different commands that'll take all of the errors in your Ember templates that are caught by the linter and turn them into to-do items. You can even say, I want this to just be a warning for the next 50 days. And then after that, I want it to start failing. So you can build it right into your app that you're pushing yourself to fix these things by a certain date. You can't just say like, oh, I'm going to open an issue or a ticket, and then maybe we'll get around to it in 60 days. Like, no, in 60 days, the test suite stops passing, and you're going to have to make a decision about whether to extend the time frame, fix the problems. It like forces you to have that decision as a company. Oh, and another important thing here for this incremental template linting is that many of the rules baked into Ember template lint help you to make your app more accessible. And so if you're, again, trying to sell the benefit to your end users, this is a huge one. You're allowing more people to use your app as they should be able to. The next tool here is something called Lint to the Future. This will operate on your JavaScript files. And what it does is something kind of similar to template lint. It adds an ignore to each of the places where your ESLinter is throwing errors. And then it gives you this like graph that helps you track across time how many issues there still are to fix. So this one's been pretty stable. This is a very stable project, but like you could imagine, as time goes on, you can actually see these graphs go down as you resolve more of these linting errors. That's the kind of thing that you can put in your quarterly reports or your sprint wrap-ups, or like shout out to the rest of your company. It's like, hey, look at how we started with all of these problems. We've been gradually chipping away at them, and now we're down to 0 on these different things. It gives people a sense of progress and momentum. If you want to enforce linting requirements for new work, so every time someone makes a new component, it's got to pass these rules. There's tools such as Husky. This is a generic JavaScript tool. This isn't an Ember specific thing. Husky lets you say before each commit or before pushing something, new code up, it's got to pass these linters. You could kind of write basically script to do anything you want before someone's allowed to push up the code. And if you're going to do something like this, I would use the sense of like enforcement lightly. Sometimes you just got to get stuff done. You don't have enough time to learn how to do the new thing. It's important to share with your coworkers how and when and why they are allowed to circumvent a tool like this. Because you don't want to make people frustrated and hating the process and not able to do their work. We want to be more on like this happy path of gradual improvement. So make sure to communicate with everybody else in your team anytime you put these new linting tools in place so that they know what to do when they encounter these errors. All right, so another aspect here, we talked about don't disturb the roots. This is just like a general rule of thumb. When you go to upgrade your app and change a whole bunch of syntax, it'll be really tempting to do bigger refactors or like just put in tiny little fixes that you find along the way. My recommendation is don't change the behavior of the app at the same time as your refactor and upgrade. Keep a laundry list of the things that could be fixed, the things that you find, make tickets or issues, file them and do them later. If you kind of follow these tangents as you find them, you're going to get really off track. And it's also going to change the nature of the quality assurance testing that you ask other people to do. If I only do internal refactors, I can say to my coworkers, hello, please click test this. There should be no change in behavior. Once I start making other kinds of changes, now I have to say, please click test this. Also, I changed out all of these modals to use this other new format. Can you make sure that those look okay? And every time you add a new layer to that, it gets harder and harder to QA. People don't like to have to review huge pull requests. So try to keep it small. Try not to change too much at once. Another thing is that you should give yourself permission to skip over tricky things. So in this app upgrade, there's a few computed properties that I looked at them and I just don't understand what they're doing or why. And there's kind of like state happening in like 8 different places. And you know what? I'm not going to let that block me from installing these linter and fixing these other problems. I'm going to ignore that file using my linting tools and come back to it later. Maybe I'll open an issue that's just for that component so that I can keep moving forward and also know that I'm not going to break what's already there. I can give it the time and attention that it needs. And I guess I said stability is your top priority. Stability is my top priority, at least. In my day-to-day work, there's thousands of nonprofits and political campaigns that rely on me not breaking stuff. And I take that very seriously. And I try to keep it in my mind, if I'm getting frustrated of like, oh, I just can't clean up all of this stuff. There's still all these messy things. I'm feeling bad about it. I maybe shouldn't feel bad about it. I should maybe think I have prioritized my work in a way that makes sure that my users have a good experience. Maybe I don't like that it's not as neat and tidy, but I can still deliver on my promise to them. So I've talked a couple of times about how to ignore linting rules. This is one example of how to use and ignore with ESLint. So I have, just as a code comment, ESLint disable next line, and then I have the rule name. So I can add this above anything that I'm not ready to fix yet. It's really important, though, that you come back to fix this someday. This is kind of going to hide that there's a problem. That's going to hide that there's something that needs to be updated. And like, this is fine. I think through, computed properties, they're part of Ember 4. Who knows what Ember 5 will be? Will someone be mad at me years later because I ignored all of these rules and then we never had any tickets to go back and fix them? Like, they'll be able to hover over this and see Jen Weber made this change. So try to make sure that you create a plan for fixing these ignores whenever you put them in place. And then the last piece here is to measure progress. So for my garden, I tried to take a picture every month because it's easy to forget just how far I have come. As I'm working, it helps me to keep a list of all of the work that I've done, because otherwise it can feel just like, are we even making any progress? What did I even do last month? I can go back to my list and point to those as my accomplishments. When it's time for me to do things like advocate for a promotion or a raise for myself or for my coworkers, I come back to this list and I can say, hey, so-and-so spearheaded this project to resolve like 1,000 linting errors in our app, and they did it with no downtime and no user bug reports. Like, that's pretty cool. And you only really get to know those things if you take the time to quantify them. I'm also kind of the boss of my garden, so I get to say like, what is success? But your company or your teams probably have their own definitions of success. If you can tie your progress into your team goals or your organization goals, that's going to help you sell this work the next time you need to do this. This isn't like we do this once and we get to never do this again. We got to do this all the time, continually, every year. And you almost have to think about like selling that work because there's 1,000 different things that we could all be doing. How do we know that this is the right thing? So some examples would be like, how many components got refactored? How many lint ignores have we fixed? What new features of the framework or libraries that we're using got unlocked? How much time did it take? What new things did we learn? And if applicable, what are the benefits to our users? What are the things that we de-risked by doing this work now? And keep talking about those things. So in this Ember app that I was working on, it's not done yet. We are partway through. We've run all the code mods. We've installed all the linters. We've updated all the library versions. We're at the point now where we are refactoring things that the automated tools can't help us with. So to get to this point where now we have to do some by hand work, so far we have changed 153 files, 7,884 lines of code, but it was only 30 hours of developer time. This is like, 2 people times 15 hours has kind of gotten us to this place. And we're like well on our journey to make this app be like fully Octane style. And we didn't have to do it all by hand. So again, the steps that we followed for this: write down a plan, budget some time, use the tools that you have, work incrementally, don't disturb the roots, and measure your progress as you go. If you're interested to learn more about the labor of maintaining and scaling free and open source software projects, there's this really great paper that was just published this past year at escholarship.org/UC/item/3MZ2DOKK. This is a great read, even if you're not working on an open source project, because it lists out all of the invisible tasks that go into maintaining any software project. You can use this to help identify the gaps in your own organization's processes to keep your apps healthy and up to date. So again, a lot of the details of what I actually did, what commands were, what problems we ran into, they're all here on my blog, www.jenweber.dev. You can find me on Twitter at JWWWEBER or GitHub Jen Weber. And if you liked this slides theme, it came from a site called Slides Carnival that has free themes. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hey, I've got a question, not a question, but a couple of comments. First of all, it's so tempting to refactor the whole file. Like you start touching legacy code and you want to refactor everything in this file, like in a waterfall fashion. I did it so many times, and every time I failed, because the more legacy you touch, the more risky it becomes. And eventually, you just give up and revert everything and do the initial tiny change that you intended to. And you log 4 hours of work time for a tiny change. Every time I tried the refactoring everything, I failed. The second comment is about a tool called lint staged. It is paired with Husky, and it lets you lint only the files that you add to a commit, and it will ignore other files. There are two gotchas with this tool. One is that when you cancel a CLI command, you will see that your changes disappeared, and you will have a very frustrating moment thinking that you've lost hours and days of work. Turns out those go into a Git stash, so they're not technically disappeared. The second problem is that lint stage does not work well with monorepos. You only can lint those efficiently, sequentially, which will take many minutes to run. So in a monorepo, we ended up not using lint staged and pairing Husky with just a number of CLI commands in a straightforward fashion. Over.
Yeah, thanks for those lint staged tips. That's what I use as well for some of my projects together with Husky. With regards to the old code, the legacy code, the risky code, I have found that the best I can do is pair with somebody else if I'm going to tackle one of those risky files. And we have a very, most of the pairing time is dedicated to which things should we try to change, in what order, which things should we absolutely not touch. There's a, Sandy Metz has given a whole bunch of talks about how to refactor this old legacy code. Kind of one of the central points that Sandy makes is that you're always going to have lots of legacy code around. You should take like a structured strategy. There's the book 99 Bottles of Object-Oriented Programming that covers some of those things. But that when you're refactoring, focus your effort on high churn, large files. Those are really, really difficult to refactor. But I think, if we imagine just how much time it takes to refactor those big legacy files, we need to make like a careful argument for why this file needs to change versus just like leaving it as is. One of my coworkers used to tell me this phrase of like, isolate the poop, which is that you take all of your messy, scary, complicated code, and if it doesn't need to change very often, you kind of just put it in a little corner by itself and let it be, and focus your refactoring efforts on the things that do need to change over time, that need to evolve and grow. And like, that's another strategy that's helped me out. So yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I would have one. I found it like really, really cool that in your talk you showed like all the different ways like which kind of like tools and also like which features in the framework you can actually use to really do this progressive updates. Mm-hmm. And when you were talking about it, then I was kind of like thinking, oh, this is like so interesting. Like maybe, I don't know, like 5 years ago, when you were building like JavaScript apps, it would always be like a very kind of like abrupt kind of like change. You would really kind of like upgrade like in big chunks. And this sounded like very kind of like fluid and straightforward. And I was kind of like wondering, in which kind of like way do you see like the framework kind of like developing even more in this kind of like direction? Because like you as like a core team member, you might also already have like insights into where this kind of like developer experience is going.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of things that Ember has specifically done to make this possible. One is that whenever there's a major version of Ember, we don't introduce lots of new features at once. That basically theoretically, if you are at the last minor version before a new major release and you've resolved all of your deprecation warnings, you should just be able to go to the next major version. That's huge. That's not how most of the JavaScript ecosystem worked for a long time. It's still not the case for many libraries, but we can see that this pattern is now being used by other projects. So I believe the last major React version said, this is an incremental change and we're just removing deprecations and like it's meant to be this smooth upgrade path. That made me really happy because I can see like maybe they took some inspiration from Ember. Maybe Ember took some inspiration from like a shared source. I don't know, but like I really want to see that happen in all of the tools that we're using. And I think Ember's played a big role in terms of that leadership. Another reason that this is kind of this incremental path is this idea of additions. So through lots and lots of hard work from the Ember.js framework team and their contributors, they launched all these new amazing features and ways of building an Ember app in such a way that it didn't break stuff with the old style. That is incredible. There's so much work that goes into making sure that the old stuff still works the same way and you still have the new stuff available. So then it means you don't have to do a major version upgrade in order to start using the newest and best way to build components or something like that. So that's like those two things together are pretty incredible. And then there's also the strategies of like lint to the future and the template lint helpers that let you change your linting rules over time without causing a huge disruption to your workflows. And we have the contributors to those projects to thank for making those as well. And for kind of following this ethos of incremental updates and like being cautious about not introducing breaking changes. So what I see happening next is like there's going to be more additions in Ember. The name of the next one has already been announced. It's called Polaris. I don't know any more details about what's in it, but it's another opportunity where, as we're working towards the next evolution of what Ember apps look like, you'll be able to try it in the addition, and you won't have to convert your whole app to a new style in order to start using the new style, which is cool.
Yeah, totally, fully agree, and thank you.
Sure.
Are there any more questions? Feel free to also post in the chat if you don't want to chat directly. If there are none, then yeah, thank you so much again, for this amazing talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sure. And with this, we already came to the end of the Ember.js Builder Meetup September edition. Thank you so much thank you to all the speakers that gave amazing talks like tonight. Also, thank you for everyone joining and chiming in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or also in Discord. And other than that, I hope you have a great morning, day, evening, night, whichever time zone you are in.